Hey guys, it's Dane at ZIMM'S Guitars. I just got done watching the Beatles Get Back documentary. I just got a few thoughts on what I watched. You know, of course, the Beatles, a very influential band, one of my favorite bands to listen to. Again, you know, everybody's talking about Paul McCartney pretty much taking over, and he's such a huge talent. When he would sit behind his piano and come up with these great pieces of music, and then he would kind of hum the lyric content. I've written a lot of songs myself, and there's different writing styles that you can go by. One is to just write a poem all the way out, and I'm pretty much sure that's what like Axl Rose did with Sweet Child of Mine. They wrote the whole poem out, and then he started singing it, and the guys kind of put music to it. It seemed like the Beatles sort of did it the opposite way. They would come up with a little guitar riff, and they would come up with a vocal melody up in their brain before they had any of the lyric content. So I thought that was kind of strange. You know, there are a lot of bands, and I think Black Sabbath is one of the kind of bands where you come up with a riff, you know, da 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 da, and then Ozzy would write, "Is he alive or dead?" And you would write the song over top of that riff and sort of shadow the riff. And but the Beatles kind of did it, in my opinion, sort of a strange way. Except not so much George. George would sit and he would write a chorus and a first verse, and then he'd write all the guitar parts and stuff. George ended up with some amazing songs. If you kind of Spotify the biggest Beatles tunes, those George Harrison songs are number 1, number 2, number 3. And so he wrote some great songs. So one thing that I did notice is the Beatles, they're not gear nerds. Now, working in a guitar shop, everybody wants to try out the latest fuzz pedal or whatever. I saw George walking around with a big square pedal. I think it might be some sort of a fuzz pedal, but none of those guys really were too interested in gear. They weren't gear addicts like all of us. And they had, you know, just a few guitars that they used. And I saw that once in a while the engineer would say, "Hey, Paul, would you try a different bass?" And he tried his Rickenbacker for a little bit, but he said he likes his old Hofner bass because it's lightweight. And so even back in those days, having a lightweight guitar was important. A lot of companies like Peavey and some guitar brands started to sort of equate a heavier guitar as something that has better sound and different things like that. But, you know, sometimes a heavy guitar meant quality, but Paul liked his lightweight bass that he had. And there was one shot where he was playing the Rickenbacker that he has, and he had it all painted up really cool and everything. But the nut, he said the nut on it was for a right-handed guitar, and the string kept coming out of the nut, so he didn't enjoy playing that guitar at all. You did see him playing a Martin acoustic that was a right-handed guitar that he had flipped around left. So we don't really know if the nut on that Martin acoustic was a lefty nut, but you never know. But it was kind of refreshing to see those guys were not super into the gear. Their equipment was just tools for making music. There was one scene where Paul's Les Paul fell off the drum riser, and so they weren't that interested in you know, how guitars were set up or what string gauge was on them, or what, you know, they had those brand new Fender amplifiers, but other than that, they didn't really care what equipment they were playing on. It just seemed like they were just tools to make music, and that was kind of refreshing that they weren't these, you know, gear nerd kind of guys. And it was also interesting that we never saw a guitar tuner in the whole 9-hour show. They had pianos, and Billy Preston was on an organ, and once in a while they would ask him to hit a chord. So they all had really good ears. And so they would just tune by ear on everything. You know, they had a really nice piano in there. They would tune to that. And so those guys being maybe just a little slightly out of tune, even though they had a great ear, there's probably parts where they're a little tiny bit out of tune, and that gave the music a real human quality about it, other than being perfectly set up in a grid and everything being perfectly in perfect tune. The Beatles had a human quality about them, you know. But it was really amazing to watch McCartney just put a bass in his hand and just kind of come up with and he's just, you know, doing this kind of thing, and you can see the wheels turning, and then he starts going, and it's weird where that just came out of nowhere without a group of lyrics in front of him. And that was a really fun part to watch, because we've all heard those songs so many times, and it's weird to finally figure out how did they put this stuff together. And you know, that was cool. There was some sort of aggravating parts that the way they would just goof off all the time, always telling jokes. Now, I've been in bands, and I was in a punk rock band, and sometimes when you're in a band and you guys aren't making any money, this has nothing to do with the Beatles. This is my own personal experience. You're in a band, you guys go play bar gigs for free most of the time. You do your 45-minute slot just to go out and drink some beers and have a good time with you guys. When you're at band practice, you have to make that fun, or these guys aren't going to show up anymore. So as, you know, as the leader of the band that I was in, I would just try to make sure that the guys in my band were having fun. And even when you were at rehearsal, you had to make it fun, or after a while these guys, you know, they wouldn't show up, and you know, you'd work with a drummer for a couple of years, and they'd be like, it's no fun anymore, man. You're being a dick. You're coming off like Paul McCartney at band practice. You're trying to get too much done. But the Beatles, they seem like they goofed around so much. As a songwriter, when you're a Paul McCartney type of person and you're hearing this in your head and you're just getting one distraction after another, I would, after a while, I'd pick my guitar up and I would just smash it over an amp, because this is frustrating when I still do this in the band that I'm in right now. I have a little riff going on, and I'm like, guys, try it again from the top. And then I'll be and trying to hum something. And it's super aggravating when the other guys in your band are saying, no, that's no good. And they discount you know, your ideas before you can even get them out. And, you know, sometimes guitar players do that, because I'm a bass player too. Sometimes guitar players do that kind of thing. And another thing that's aggravating, and the Beatles never did this, but another thing that's aggravating to me is I would come up with a riff, and the guys in the band, you listen to whatever riff you come up with, the other guys in the band, immediately they say something like, oh, well, that sounds like, you know, The Cure. Or that riff sounds like Feel Like Making Love by Bad Company. So before you have a chance to write a good riff, the other guys in your band are already saying, no, I've already heard that. And so that gets aggravating. So I can understand, you know, how Paul would be very aggravated with the other guys in the band. But he knew enough to not let all the joking and those guys having fun. You know, the Beatles pretty much, when they first came out in the scene, the Beatles made fun of like everything they did, every interview that the Beatles did back in the old days, and they would make a joke about every question. Everything the Beatles did, they were joking about it, and in those early interviews. So it was always part of their gag to just act totally unserious with the whole thing. But then once you started seeing them in the studio, when they were like, okay, here we go, John Lennon would be the one that would count it off. He'd go 1, 2, 3, and then they'd kick into the song. So in a lot of ways, John did sort of take over as the group leader when it came right down to it, where they were clicking the song off to go into a new song for recording. John, his leadership did kind of come through in those spots. And so, yeah, there's a lot to it when you're in a band, man. There's a lot of inner politics within the members of the band. You got to make sure every other guy sitting there, you know, is you got to make sure that all the other guys in your band are happy, and you can't, you know, make mistakes and the other guys get mad at you. One thing I will say about the Beatles is I never heard one or any of the other guys, you know, talking down the ability, oh, don't play a riff like that, that doesn't sound good. Those guys always put those riffs together real nicely. And sometimes it took them a week or two of rehearsing a song that they just had like one verse together, and then after 2 or 3 weeks of practicing, then they finally sort of really got down to business and would change the words around, and that was a lot of fun to see. I think, you know, I sort of have this theory about there are so many other musicians in this world that they didn't have the ability to go into the studio with their bandmates at 10, 11 o'clock in the morning and have a sound engineer right there, have breakfast made for them. The Beatles were able to go into the studio and be creative and write their songs, not worried about, oh, I'm not getting a paycheck this week. There's so many musicians, and there's so many musicians that don't have free studio time. In this day and age, my band, we'd have to go and practice for months to get our stuff tight, and then you have to go and you have to pay big money to go into a studio to get any kind of good results. And it was even worse in the 1980s when you had to record on 2-inch tape and everything. But it costs a lot of money to go in the studio, and you couldn't go in the studio and waste time and joke around and laugh with each other and do take after take after take. You got one take, you know, to do your thing and to make it sound good. And a lot of times I'm telling people, hey, if I had my favorite local guitar player, if my band could go in the studio all day long, 5 days a week, and just be creative and come up with stuff, it would be amazing. So many other bands would be out in the world with great music, but you know, us poor musicians, there's no chance of us going in the studio and just trying to be creative, you know, hour after hour of every day. We're all weekend warriors, and if you go in the studio, man, that's a big deal. You have to be super serious about being in the recording studio. You can't lollygag around like the Beatles were doing, but they did get to a point where when it came right down to the wire and they had to finally hit record on their machine, that they did come up with some really good stuff. The ability of Paul and John to harmonize together so effortlessly, those two guys singing together, there was just something magical about those two guys singing together. They worked hard on their harmonies, and they knew that harmonies were important. And yeah, it was a lot to take in. There's 9 hours of footage to watch, And you can even, once in a while, you can hear Paul singing a little tiny bit of Imagine. And we all thought that that was a John Lennon song, and only John was the only one that's ever, heard that one. But it was amazing how they would work on songs that ended up being on the next album, which was the Abbey Road album. So it was very interesting, and it was a lot of fun to see how they worked together. And, again, it was aggravating watching them goof around so much. But that was their way of, dealing with that much fame and dealing with that much pressure to have a new album out. Every day they would have the newspaper out and they would read what the critics are talking about them, and, all the breakup news that would come out. And there was even an article where they were fist fighting each other, and so there was a lot to live up to. They knew they were the greatest band in the world, but they were definitely sort of in a slump, and a lot of that had to do with their manager passing away 18 months before that. But they, without a manager, and they had a lot of money in the bank at that time, and they really didn't need to get together and make new records, but props to them for still working on it. They didn't completely give up on the whole idea of being the Beatles, but yeah, it was a fun documentary to watch, and I'll probably even watch it again because there's so much going on in those 9 hours. And guys, if you get a chance to watch it, I highly recommend it. Thanks you guys for listening. We'll talk to you later.